families appear a certain way to casual acquaintances. They were the nicest people. They were quiet, but you never, ever know what goes on in a private home when the doors are closed and the lights are out.
It's a busy summer night for Colorado Springs.
Dispatch to Medic 5.
Medic 5, go ahead.
31 traffic.
A typical shift at that time was 24 hours. You worked 8 in the morning to 8 the following morning. You could run anywhere from actually 15 to 20 calls.
We have a victim that's unresponsive. PD is already on scene.
Medic 5 responding.
There we go. Code 3 at that particular time was urgent. You go as fast as possible, but as safely as you possibly can.
EMTs Mark McDonald and Mark Bruning are responding to a call at a residence near Palmer Park on the city's east side.
Once we got there, the PD were already on scene, and so our part of our job was to go in and actually assess the patient.
Where's the patient?
He's in the master bedroom.
All right.
It's kind of surreal, to tell you the truth, because you're thrown immediately into this chaotic scene.
Up here, up here.
Get the heart rate monitor on him.
You guys, please. Everything's gonna be okay.
But it was pretty well obvious at that time that this gentleman was deceased.
Nothing.
Several miles away, Sergeant Joe Kenda is already waist-deep in an unrelated investigation.
Did the suspect make a statement?
No, not yet. But he had a bloody knife on him. I think it's a murder weapon.
It's after 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm at the scene of a homicide. Crime never sleeps, crime never takes a day off, and everybody seems to like the cover of darkness.
The coroner's on his way. Oh, great.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1. Team back in the car.
Go for 4 Paul 1.
We have a report of a shooting near Palmer Park. First responders are saying they believe it's self-inflicted.
The initial report was this is probably a suicide, and I decided to remain at my current crime scene and send one of my detectives and report back to me.
Within the hour, Kenda detectives to the residence near Palmer Park.
Good evening, Detective.
Hey, what do we got here?
39-year-old male, single gunshot wound to the head. Appears to be self-inflicted.
Victim, he is now disconnected.
They had identified him as an individual named Charlie Tuttle, who actually worked for the city of Colorado Springs in the electric division.
Before I met Charlie, he was a staff sergeant in the Air Force, and he worked in electronics, repairing and calibrating flight simulators. He was always perceived as a very honest and trustworthy person.
Looks like the wife, stepdaughter, and a neighbor discovered him in the bedroom. We cut the neighbors loose. He didn't know anything.
Okay. Now where's the body?
Upstairs in the bedroom.
Lead the way.
In the master bedroom, Mr. Tuttle is laying face down on the bed.
The family found him like this?
Yes, sir.
Upon initial examination of the scene, detectives noted that, in fact, the victim still had a .22 caliber in his hand.
It looks like somebody kicked the door in.
It's apparent that there was forced entry into the room, wherein this person was discovered.
This is the only entry into the room.
There's a shoe print on the door next to the door handle assembly.
Witnesses claim that they broke the door in after they heard the gunshot.
We have an individual who was depressed and actually locked himself in the bedroom. climbed into bed and shot himself. That's a pretty good possibility at this point.
To confirm that possibility, investigators need to see if witnesses' stories lead to the same conclusion.
Well, let's go talk to the family. If he killed himself, maybe they can tell us why.
They then speak to the wife of the victim, whose name is Jackie Tuttle. She's 42 years of age.
Mrs. Tuttle, I'm so sorry for your loss. Do you mind answering a few questions?
Jackie is kind of quiet, soft-spoken. She worked for a real estate company, and she had been married to Charles for about 14 years. He was actually her second husband.
Do you and Charlie have any kids together?
No. I have 2 grown children from my first marriage. My older daughter, Jennifer, she lives back in Texas with her father. And Sarah, she lives here with us, and she was here tonight.
So how was class today?
Okay. My partner called out sick, though.
Jackie says, well, it was a nice Friday evening for the family. She had planned a really nice dinner.
Well, this looks great.
Hope you like it.
She had prepared some shrimp cocktail, which was a favorite of her husband's.
Oh, babe. Can you give me another?
This is good.
Here, darling.
No, I don't think so. I'll be fine.
She says the evening progressed in a normal manner, except for the fact that Charlie was drinking heavily during dinner.
Now, how much alcohol did Charlie consume?
I don't know, like 10 beers and some whiskey.
Jackie reports to the officers that her husband seemed to be very distressed after dinner and continued to drink and said he was going to bed.
So around midnight, Sarah and I went down and put a movie in downstairs. That's when we heard the gunshot. I'm sorry. I can't breathe. I can't.
It's okay. Thank you.
And that's when she became so distressed and she could not continue conversing with the officers because of her emotional state.
Hoping to learn why Charlie was distressed, investigators turned to Jackie's daughter, 19-year-old Sarah Reynolds.
Excuse me, Sarah. Do you have a moment to answer a few questions?
They ask her to describe the events of the evening, separate from her mother, and she tells precisely the same story.
You live here with your mom and Charlie?
Yeah.
She indicated that she recently moved into her mother's house and was attending the Colorado Beauty College.
Mom thought it would be a good idea to live here to save money, which helps. So after dinner, Charlie went to bed, and Mom and I watched a movie in the living room.
Please be with me. Be with me, please.
And it was about 1:30 when she heard a loud bang.
What was that?
Charlie!
We went upstairs, but his door was locked. We tried to force the door to open, but it wouldn't budge.
And her mother said, go get the neighbor, he can help us. And she did that.
The neighbor came over and kicked the door in, and that's when we found him on the bed.
Now, I know this is difficult, Sarah, but can you think of any reason that Charlie may have wanted to end his life?
Yeah. He was just so different since the accident.
About a year earlier, he'd been in a very serious car accident.
Come here, honey. Come here, let me help you. Please, here, let's get this out of the way.
He was struck from behind by another car. It injured Charlie's neck and caused him pain in his neck and upper back.
His personality changed after that. He was so down about everything, constantly called out of work.
He became more depressed. He drank more. Now, all of that put together certainly sounds like someone who may be willing to end their days.
After dinner, he was complaining that his neck hurt. Maybe he just had enough of the pain, you know?
Yeah. Once again, I'm truly sorry for your loss.
Hours later, Sergeant Kenda requests a status report on Charlie Tuttle's case.
We found it odd that he shot himself in the back of the head, but all of the evidence that we found at the scene is consistent with suicide.
So what's the coroner think?
Oh, here's the report.
By law, the coroner determines the method of death and the manner.
Okay, thank you.
The coroner's office is fully informed of the details about Charlie's recent history and his motor vehicle accident and his depression, and the coroner rules it as a suicide, and the matter is closed, or so everyone thought.
6 months later, an unexpected visitor shows up at CSPD.
Sarah Reynolds? All right, have a seat. Someone will be with you in just a moment.
Thank you.
When someone comes into police headquarters and asks to speak to someone in homicide, they are directed to a supervisor, which in that case was me.
Hi, I'm Sergeant Kenda. Is there something I can help you with?
She had a pretty forlorn look on her face and was somewhat quiet.
The body language suggests that maybe she just wants to leave and is sorry she came in here.
It's all right. Anything you need to tell us, it'll be okay.
Well, my stepfather, Charlie Tuttle, he died 6 months ago in our house.
Okay.
And she looked at me and she said, well, I told a story to the policeman about how my stepdad killed himself.
But I was lying.
Oh, my. Well, this is getting interesting. A 39-year-old man named Charlie Tuttle is believed to have shot himself in the privacy of his locked bedroom. Now it's 6 months later, and a young lady has come forward to say she lied, that none of what she said to the police was true.
Okay, why don't you just start from the beginning?
So, the night he died, I helped my mom make dinner.
Hey, honey, can you grab me the parsley?
What's all this?
Something special for Charlie.
Jackie had actually picked up a bottle of Crown Royal whiskey, some cigars, and a fishing magazine.
Wow, Mom.
Right?
And Sarah thought that was kind of unusual because Jackie and Charlie had been arguing quite a bit lately.
And she suspected the marriage was coming to an end.
I thought it was her way of showing him she still loved him and wanted to make things work. And then when Charlie came home, he was in such a good mood.
Oh, wow. It's not my birthday.
No?
Oh, are you making your famous meatballs?
She said he was quite surprised and happy to see them fixing a nice meal for dinner.
And when we sat down to dinner, Mom and Charlie were reminiscing about old times.
This looks great.
Thank you.
Oh. Man, does the sauce taste funny to you?
No, I think it's fine.
I think the horseradish went bad. Yeesh.
He didn't care for the shrimp cocktail, but he certainly ate everything else and drank his beer as he normally did.
Could you pass me that garlic bread, please?
We had a really nice evening. And then Mom wanted to watch a movie. But Charlie said he's going to bed to read his fishing mag.
Do you remember what time that was?
No, I just remember the movie started and I must have totally passed out.
And that struck me. I passed out? Why did you pass out? Were you drinking?
No, I just remember feeling so tired all of a sudden. I couldn't keep my eyes open. And then I woke up around 1:30.
The house was quiet. The movie was on pause.
Her mother, Jackie, wasn't there, and so she's sitting there on the couch. And then she heard this loud boom from upstairs.
Mom?
Her mother is holding a green bath towel, and protruding from the bath towel is a gun.
Honey, I need you to stay calm, okay?
But what did you do?
Honey, I did it for his own good.
According to Sarah, she says, you know that Charlie's been in a lot of pain, and if anybody asked you, he did it to himself.
Now, I need you to take this towel and put it in the basement. Take it.
And she puts the gun on the bed next to Charlie's hand, and then walks out and locks the door behind them and says, now go get the neighbor to force the door open. So I listened to Sarah's story, and I said, well, Sarah, I must ask you the obvious question.
All right, but this was 6 months ago. Why you just bring it to us now?
Because I was scared. My mom threatened to kill me if I said anything.
But she told him that I'm coming in to tell the truth because I have so much guilt.
That lock was brand new.
Sarah says that her mother had installed a lock on the bedroom door 2 days earlier, and she asked Charlie to install it for her.
I overheard her tell Charlie it was to keep me out of that room.
Why was that?
She told him it was to stop me from stealing from them. But I think she was planning to kill him the whole time. I can't sleep. I have nightmares about it.
Do you have any idea why your mother wanted to kill Charlie?
Yeah, she's greedy.
She said he had a $49,000 insurance policy, and she wanted that money.
And she got it too.
Perhaps in her mother's mind, she had 49,000 reasons to kill Charlie.
So, you're going to reopen his case?
We're definitely going to look into it and keep in touch. I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
You must take people seriously when they tell you a story. Do you trust what they say? Of course not. Let's explore your story. So my first step is to go to the coroner's office. I inform the coroner of the new development, and the coroner agrees to review the report.
So I looked over all the reports again. This is extremely unusual.
Indeed. So what do you think?
Well, I did notice one thing. The witnesses claimed that Mr. Tuttle had been drinking heavily, but that's not what we're seeing in his toxicology results.
The blood alcohol content of Charlie was 0.01. That is not even legally impaired, let alone drunk.
Yeah, it is strange. Well, after looking through everything, are you still confident it's a suicide?
You know, there's nothing in the report that contradicts suicide, but it is odd that he shot himself in the back of the head.
Yeah, it's very uncommon.
And I vaguely remember there was something else I found fishy, but that was like 40 autopsies ago. I don't remember now. I'll read through my notes again and see if I can figure out what it is.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Doc.
With the coroner's report inconclusive, Kenda's gut tells him to keep digging.
Mr. Wade, I'm Sergeant Kenda. Thanks for meeting me.
Glad to help however I can.
So Joe took an unusual step, and that was to contact the funeral director who embalmed the body of Charlie.
I said, well, in my experience, I've seen over 100 gunshot wounds to the head from people who kill themselves.
There was something that just wasn't quite right about this one. I actually remember it quite well.
If you put a gun to your head, it is extremely difficult to get a 90-degree contact. You're up, you're down, you're this way, that way, left and right. The result is the entrance wound itself is not round. It's shaped differently.
And when I looked at the hole on the inside of the skull, it was much larger, but still symmetrical. Most of the time, you don't get a perfect 90-degree angle.
He said at that point in time, I was suspicious that this was in fact not a suicide, but he went on with the embalming anyway.
There's not much that surprises me in this business, but this one did.
Well, thank you. You've been very helpful.
So this evidence is adding up nicely to murder and not suicide. And with that, we decided to reopen the case.
Kenda and his team start by tracking down Charlie Tuttle's widow at her new home.
So we want to go see Jackie now because I've got a lot more information other than just Sarah's allegations. I know the physical evidence says that Charlie didn't shoot himself.
Do you guys take anything in your coffee?
No, just black, thank you. I wouldn't mind some sugar if that's okay.
Sure.
The first thing we noticed is very sparse. Pretty little furniture, very neat, very clean.
Where are all the family photos?
There are no pictures of her husband, almost sterile, if you will. You might think, well, is this person trying to forget what might have happened?
It is very odd to have a personal home that contains no evidence of memorabilia of your family. So there's something already quite odd about Jackie.
So, what do you guys want to talk about?
Well, your daughter Sarah stopped into the precinct.
She did? Why?
We tell her, your daughter came to report that you killed your husband and swore her to secrecy.
She's lying. It's an absolute lie.
Now, Mrs. Tuttle, why would your daughter make up a story like that?
It's obvious. She wants more money.
And we looked at her and we said, excuse me, what do you mean by more money?
Victim, he is now disconnected.
So we're investigating this suicide of Charlie Tuttle, which has now become a homicide based on the physical evidence and based on the fact that the daughter accuses the mother of having committed this murder.
And Jackie tells Joe, oh, she's lying. She only wants more money. Well, more money, what does that mean?
I guess the trouble started with Sarah when Charlie passed away.
She said there was a life insurance policy that was worth $49,000. I received the $49,000. I felt guilty about having all that money. And Sarah, who was a starving beauty college student, had no money.
I gave her 10 grand to finish school. I wanted to help her. I wanted her to get on her own 2 feet for once.
Sarah was the kind of kid where she'd never really had to go out and earn a living.
You know, I guess my daughter's a bit of a sponge.
What do you mean?
Well, she would take money and live off of it from the guys that she was dating. And then after that, she came and lived with us. And that's when she got Charlie wrapped around her little finger.
Really? How so?
She reports that a year ago, she broke up with a boyfriend in Texas and was so distressed, she called her mother, Jackie, and said, can I please come and live with you?
And when she moved in, Charlie would always give her money for different things that she needed.
Charles was the kind of guy that whatever Sarah wanted, he'd get for her, even bought her a new car.
Now he's gone, and here we are.
So what's all this have to do with Sarah saying you killed your husband?
Like I said, she wanted more of Charlie's insurance money.
Jackie tells Joe that she burns through that $10,000 just in a few months. And she's already back asking for more with her hand out.
So she was threatening for the money?
No, she wasn't threatening. She was just asking weird questions about the insurance policy.
Like what?
She said, Sarah's been talking a lot about the insurance and who the beneficiary actually was. And Jackie felt that that was somewhat suspicious.
She says, I'm sure that Sarah believes if I get arrested for this and I go to prison, she'll wind up with the rest of the money.
While Kenda knows that life insurance payouts don't work that way, it's entirely possible that Sarah doesn't.
Well, thank you for talking to us, and thanks for the coffee.
Sure. You know, I hope this gets sorted out quickly, and I'm really sorry my daughter dragged you into this.
We'll let ourselves out.
We decide we're leaving. We have no intention of arresting Jackie at this point.
Well, that was interesting.
It sure was.
And all the way back to the car, looking at each other, like, how did we get involved in this?
Hey, when you get time, can you look into Tuttle's insurance policy?
Yeah, we'll do.
In the meantime, I'm going to find out more about Jackie and Sarah.
Good idea. I mean, even if Sarah is as greedy as Jackie says, would she really do that to her mom?
Right.
It's incredible that you find a family like this in a situation like this 6 months after the event. So how do you decide that the daughter is so vindictive and so evil that she will try to put her mother in prison over something her mother didn't do? How does that work? Well, I don't know, because I'm not crazy.
Hoping to learn more about Jackie and Sarah's relationship,
Barbara?
Kenda's team tracks down someone close to the family.
We discover a mutual friend whose name is Barbara Levitt.
I'm Detective Kenda.
What can I do for you, Detective?
So you're friends with Jackie Tuttle?
Yeah, I know Jackie. I've known her since 11th grade. Back when we lived in Texas. Almost 25 years. I didn't think I was that old.
I'm sure flies, don't it?
Do you know her daughters?
Oh, yeah, I've known Jennifer and Sarah since they were born.
So we have not just a friend, but a really good friend who should have some insight into these people.
So what can you tell us about Jackie and Charlie's relationship?
Jackie met Charlie in Texas. She was still married to Edward.
She was living in a very contentious relationship with her husband, wanted out of that, and she felt Charlie would be her way out.
So Jackie divorced Edward and married Charlie.
According to Barbara, Jackie followed her new husband all the way to Colorado Springs. According to Barbara, Jackie fell head over heels in love with Charlie, and on his end, the feeling was mutual.
So what happened with the girls? Sarah and Jennifer, right?
Those poor girls. They ended up going and staying with their dad. I mean, Sarah took it the hardest. She was only 3 or 4. She just didn't understand.
Barbara indicated that Sarah has resented her mother her entire life.
You know, here's somebody that's supposed to love you more than anything, and here she is not only leaving the family, but moving far away. She's basically abandoning you.
I think that's why Sarah's been a little bit of a troublemaker.
What do you mean?
You know, psychology. Sarah's childhood's warped her mind. She was always around conflict. You know, first her parents, then Jackie and Charlie.
Really? What'd they fight about?
Well, they fought about money. A lot of couples fight about money.
And I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but...
She said, well, I knew that Charlie was having an affair.
An affair?
Yeah, he had a girlfriend. Jackie was devastated.
So Jackie leaves her husband and her 2 children for the love of her life. And now, the love of her life has a girlfriend. Now that's a motive for murder. So in this investigation of the death of Charlie Tuttle, we've come a long way. And now we learn that there's an affair involved, which really puts the emotions on edge.
They had some pretty bad arguments over this woman. Charlie swore he wasn't cheating on her.
And why did Jackie think he was having an affair?
What?
She says that she had found some notes between Charlie and this woman called Betsy. And so Jackie was convinced that he was going to leave her for Betsy.
Is this something that could push somebody over their edge to commit murder? You bet it is.
While Jackie may have had a motive for murder, countering that is the fact that Charlie had a motive for suicide, according to Jackie.
We've got to find somebody else now that may know about that. And we determined that Charlie had a best friend, and we want to know what that friend knows about the affair.
Excuse me, Hugh Hines?
Yes, sir.
I'm Sergeant Kenda. We talked on the phone. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Charlie and I worked together for nearly 7 years at the power station. He was an excellent mentor to me.
Can you tell me about Charlie?
He was very generous, very outgoing, real outdoorsman.
His passion was fishing. He really studied the subject, and he was very good at it.
I also heard he was in a bad accident. Was he depressed about that?
No, I don't think so. He's depressed about his marriage.
We were close enough where we shared very personal information, and so I know that Jackie and Charlie were having difficulties in their relationship.
Hey, buddy.
Hey.
How's it going? Nice to see Jackie's gonna let you out of the house for a change.
Jackie.
Yeah?
It's a thorn in my side.
Uh-oh, what's going on?
Well, you know I'm working like a dog, and I work around the clock, and she spends every damn dime I make. And she's spending money I don't even have, bro.
Is it getting that bad?
Yeah. And I'd like to retire someday. I don't want to work till I'm 100 years old. But she's not having it.
Let's go drink some beer and catch some fish.
Sounds good. Would you come fishing with me in Alaska?
She, according to Charlie, went through money like a machine. The way it seemed to work is that Jackie would take Charlie's paycheck, he would turn it over to her, and then it was just gone.
Was Charlie planning on leaving her?
Yeah, he was just trying to figure out how to get his retirement funds out first.
I'm not sure if these were exactly Charlie's words, but the message was that I have had it. I'm just taking my dog, my guns, and I'm going to Alaska.
Alaska?
Mm-hmm.
Was he going with someone?
No, Charlie just wanted to be alone.
We say, well, Hugh, we hear a story that maybe Charlie was having an affair with some woman named Betsy.
No way, man. He wasn't having an affair with Betsy.
Charlie and Betsy were friends. There was certainly no sexual relationship. Charlie never did anything except work and fish.
He said Betsy was married. She lived in another state, and Charlie would often call her and talk to her. But Jackie knew about her and was very jealous about her.
Charlie, as a matter of fact, had told Jackie that he was just fed up with her and he was going to move out and divorce her. It's just because he wanted away from Jackie.
Well, I appreciate the help.
Absolutely.
So what do we do now? Charlie was apparently planning on leaving his wife and taking his money and going to Alaska. Instead, he winds up with a bullet in his head. All signs point to Jackie. What we need now is the proof.
Kenda decides it's time to go back to the very beginning.
I want to talk to the first person who entered that home after the shooting.
Sarge, Eric, Fillmore's here to see you.
Come on, have a seat.
The neighbor who kicked down Charlie's door.
Thanks for coming in. Sure. What can I help you with? Can you walk me through what happened the night Charlie Tuttle died?
Okay. Well, I was sleeping and Sarah came over and woke me up. And she said Charlie hurt himself.
I was in a fog of sleep, waking up like, what? Basically, she just wanted me to come over and check it out.
He goes with her over to the house. Jackie's on her knees in the hallway, crying hysterically. He tries the door. It is, in fact, locked.
And then I think she encouraged me, can you break it in? I said, okay.
Charlie? No, stay back. Stay back.
At that point, Charlie? I smelled gun smoke. I could visually see a haze in the room.
And then I saw the blood and the gun. I ran downstairs and called 911.
It's burned in my brain, I would say. In my mind's eye, I can glimpse the metal of the gun, his head, and the blood.
I've got some crime scene photos. Would you mind taking a look at them?
Yeah, sure. No, this is not what I saw.
That's not the way I found it. It was different in the photo than how I came upon the scene. I entered the bedroom. You could tell that there was somebody in the bed.
Charlie!
But the comforter was pulled all the way up.
Charlie!
Now, if you're going to shoot yourself, would you hide under a blanket to do it? No. But if you kill somebody and you don't want to look at them when they're dead and feel the guilt, you cover them up. Well, my. That's important.
Even with Eric Fillmore's statement, Kenda's case against Jackie Tuttle is weak. As he's pondering how to strengthen it, a possible solution surfaces.
Hey, Sarge, remember when you told me to check into Charlie's insurance policy? Mm-hmm. You're gonna like this.
We confirmed that Jackie did receive $49,000 from the insurance company, paid her daughter Sarah $10,000, and they have bank deposits into Sarah's account of $10,000.
Okay, but Jackie already told us that.
Yeah, but what's strange is her other daughter, Jennifer, didn't get a penny.
And why would the mother give money to one daughter, not the other?
Were you buying her silence for your $10,000 investment? That's a reasonable conclusion.
We know where Sarah currently lives?
Yeah, I'll get your address.
Thanks.
So we go to find her, and we find that she's living with her grandmother, Debbie.
Thank you.
Can I get you anything else?
No, thank you. So, Sarah, the one thing that's been bothering us is why would your mother give you money from the life insurance and not your sister?
And Sarah was dumbstruck that we knew that. She just looked at us. She had nothing to say. Nothing.
I think it was to keep Sarah's mouth shut.
Grammy?
What do you mean with that?
Debbie went on to say that the day before the shooting took place, she had gotten a phone call from Jackie.
Hello?
Hey, Mom. Are you busy?
No, I just got home from work. What's going on?
Debbie is a nurse, and her daughter Jackie wanted to know if she combined a sleeping agent called Restoril with alcohol, would that make somebody really sleepy? Would it make them fall very, very soundly asleep?
Oh, yeah, but you really shouldn't mix those. Why are you asking?
I'm just curious. Actually, Mom, I'm sorry, I gotta go. There's someone at the door.
Okay, I'll talk to you later. It was a very
very odd phone call.
And when she made that comment to me, I'm thinking back to the story about the family dinner.
I just remember feeling so tired all of a sudden. I couldn't keep my eyes open.
That Charlie didn't eat the cocktail sauce because he thought it tasted funny.
Unusual way.
Does Jackie have access to that drug?
Charlie's doctor prescribed it for him after his car accident to help him fall asleep easier.
Jackie, you thought you were going to walk, but you're not. Because we're going to walk over to your house and take you to jail. After this long, prolonged investigation, all the information we have learned adds up circumstantially to the guilt of Jackie Tuttle. We're going to place her in custody for the death of her husband.
Over the next couple hours, Kenda and his team hit the streets.
And they do find Jackie about 11:30 that night in a local watering hole.
What are you guys doing here?
Jackie, I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Charles Tuttle.
You can't be serious.
Cuff her. Come with me.
Sarah is lying. She just wants the money.
And I looked at her and I said, well, Jackie, you have a problem.
Well, she wasn't the only one telling us that.
But I didn't do it.
That's not what the evidence says.
So we're going to take you in front of a jury of your peers and let them decide about your future. Come with us.
And Jackie got real silent and looked at Joe and said, I want a lawyer. She was then taken into custody, taken into county jail and booked.
Even without a confession, Kenda believes he knows what transpired.
In my opinion, based on what I've learned, I think that Jackie knew her husband was going to leave her.
And so Jackie might be thinking, if Charlie's going to leave me high and dry, how am I going to survive on my part-time salary? And who's going to take care of me in my retirement?
Kenda theorizes that at that point, Jackie hatched a plan to stage her husband's suicide and collect a 5-figure insurance payout.
She had a lock installed in that bedroom door 2 days before the death.
Wow. Looks like you bought out the whole mall.
Pretty much. We always need stuff. You know that. Honey, when you have some time, will you install this on our door?
Sure, but do we really need this?
I'd feel a lot better knowing that Sarah can't get in there and steal anything.
Okay. I'll do it later. After my beer.
Isn't this cute?
Yeah, that's nice. Do we still have the receipt for it?
She asked her own mother, the nurse, how to devise some sort of drug to make him fall asleep.
But she also needed to drug her daughter so that she wouldn't be able to interfere with her plan.
This looks great. Huh. I think the horseradish went bad.
So she served the his favorite food, shrimp cocktail. But she didn't realize the drug would leave a weird taste in the sauce. And Charlie didn't eat anything that contained the drug, and that's why his toxicology screens came back negative.
However, Sarah finished her portion, and when she passed out on the couch, Jackie decided it was now or never.
Jackie quietly went up to Charlie's room and grabbed a towel and a handgun. To her dismay, Jackie sees that Charlie has fallen asleep on his stomach. and realizes it will be suspicious if he shoots himself in the back of the head.
Jackie knows if she tries to roll him over, he might wake up. Then how is she going to explain this gun in her hand?
And she realizes there is no turning back. And she points the gun at his head. And pulls the trigger.
And then she went to work, staging the bedroom to look like a suicide.
Everything about this crime scene is not a spontaneous thing. She thought about it and carried it out.
Jackie Tuttle is charged with first-degree murder. Her daughter, Sarah Reynolds, is not charged with any crime.
Unfortunately, you never can predict what's going to happen during the trial. And Jackie's mother took the stand and recanted a lot of the information that she had given before.
In the court, you need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So now the jury is left with making a decision. Who's lying? Everybody's lying. And they found Jackie not guilty of first-degree murder. Charlie went to his grave, and nobody paid the price. It's the reality of the court system. You're innocent until you're proven guilty.
In my opinion, I don't believe Charlie killed himself. I think it was a wrong decision on their part. I think she got away with killing Charlie.
It's just interesting how somebody could be involved in something like that and then go on to live just a very normal, carefree life.
Hi. Wow.
Maybe she has had a really happy life and been able to enjoy all that money that she was so desperate to have.
You've often heard it said that time heals all wounds. Time also heals guilt. People's attitudes, memories, and fearfulness have washed away with time.
The first scream didn't come from a person. It came from the radio. At 5:42 a.m., a police dispatcher's voice cut through the static on Chicago's South Side frequency flat. Rushed, already tired, reporting a body found near the Calumet River. Female, young, no identification, temperature dropping, sky still dark. Winter refusing to loosen its grip on the city. By the time the words possible homicide left the speaker, the scream had already spread, invisible, through the alleys and row houses and corner diners just beginning to wake. Chicago had learned by 1979 to recognize that sound. It was the sound of something that would not go away. The river lay still at morning. A thick black ribbon slicing through steel and concrete, carrying oil slicks and broken reflections of street lamps. The body was half submerged, coat soaked, hair plastered to her face as if the water itself had tried to erase her. One shoe was missing. The other hung loose as though she had tried to run and failed. There were marks on her wrists, deep and even, not decorative, not accidental, the kind of marks that make detectives stop talking. They lifted her out slowly because the cold had stiffened her into a shape that no longer looked human. She was small, lighter than expected. Someone muttered that she couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. Someone else noticed the bruise along her jaw, already blooming into something dark and unmistakable. No purse, no wallet, no papers, just a cheap ring on her left hand and a smear of blood under one fingernail that would later be scraped, bagged, labeled, and forgotten for decades. Within an hour, the neighborhood knew. Within a day, the city did. Chicago in 1979 was already on edge. Crime headlines stacked up like unpaid bills. Trust in the system was thin, brittle, ready to crack. When the papers ran the first story, young woman found dead near Calumet River, it landed hard. When the second story ran, police seek identity in suspected homicide, it landed harder. And when the third headline used the words cold case for the first time, even before the body had a name, it felt like a curse spoken out loud. She was identified 2 days later. Her name was Marianne Keller, 23 years old, recently moved from Indiana, worked part-time at a diner near 87th Street, lived in a shared apartment with 2 other women who barely knew her. Quiet, polite, kept to herself. Called her mother every Sunday night without fail. The kind of person who disappears not with a bang, but with a pause, a missed shift, and an answered phone. A bed that stays made. Her last confirmed sighting was Thursday night. A co-worker remembered her clocking out just before 10, pulling on her coat, complaining about the cold, saying she might walk instead of waiting for the bus because she needed air. That sentence would be quoted for years. Needed air. It sounded innocent. It sounded human. It sounded like the kind of thing people say right before something goes wrong. The walk home should have taken 15 minutes. It took her the rest of her life. Detectives canvassed the route street by street, bar by bar. They knocked on doors where lights were still on and ones where no one answered. They asked about screams, about arguments, about cars idling too long. Most people shook their heads. Some said they heard nothing. One man said he heard a woman crying, but he assumed it was just another fight. No one could describe a suspect. No one could agree on a time. The autopsy told a story the witnesses could not. Cause of death: asphyxiation, manual strangulation. Time of death estimated between 10:30 p.m. and midnight. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds, skin under her nails that did not belong to her. No evidence of sexual assault, which only deepened the confusion. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't impulse. This was personal or precise or both. The police worked fast at first. They always do. Boyfriends were questioned, exes, co-workers, the diner manager. The regulars who sat too close, stared too long, tipped too little. A man who'd been seen arguing with her weeks earlier was brought in, questioned for 6 hours, released. Another name surfaced, then sank. Leads arrived in bunches, then dried up without warning. Every tip seemed promising until it wasn't. By spring, the case slowed. By summer, it stalled. Marianne Keller became a photo on a corkboard, then a file in a cabinet, then a number. The city moved on, because cities always do. But something about this one stuck. Maybe it was the lack of a clear motive. Maybe it was the way her body had been placed, not dumped, not hidden, but left where it would be found. Maybe it was the ring, cheap silver, engraved on the inside with a single letter, J. No one could explain the ring. Years passed, detectives retired, files gathered dust. The evidence locker changed locations twice. The blood under her fingernail was logged, relabeled, then eventually boxed with hundreds of others from an era before anyone really knew what DNA could do. The Keller case slipped into that quiet category that police hate and families fear. Unresolved, unsolved, unresolved again. A cold case. Then, in the fall of 1989, a man walked into a Chicago police station and said he wanted to confess. He was 34. His name was James Rourke. he looked older, thin, nervous. He smelled like cigarettes and stale coffee. He told the desk officer he couldn't sleep anymore, that he saw her face every time he closed his eyes, that he had killed a woman 10 years earlier near the Calumet River, and he needed to stop. The room changed when he said her name, Marianne Keller. Detectives who hadn't touched a file in years were called back in. The box came out. The photos were spread across the table. Rourke talked slowly at first, then faster. He described the river, the cold, the way her shoe came off when she kicked. He knew details that hadn't been released to the press. He cried at the right moments. He hesitated at the wrong ones. When he finished, the room was silent. The city would later hear the headline before it heard the dot. Chicago 1979 cold case closed. Confession rocks the city. But in that room, in that moment, no one was celebrating yet, because one detective, older than the rest, flipped through the file again and noticed something small, something almost nothing. The letter inside the ring, the letter J. Rourke's name did not start with J, and the scream that had started this story, the one from the radio, suddenly didn't sound finished at all. The confession should have been the end of it. Confessions usually are. They come wrapped in relief, in paperwork, in the soft closing sound of a file drawer sliding shut. But this one landed wrong, like a note played half a beat too late, and the longer it hung in the air, the more obvious it became that something underneath it was off. James Rourke sat in the interview room with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, rocking almost imperceptibly, eyes fixed on the tabletop as if it were a stage, and he had forgotten his lines. He said he wanted to make it right. He said he had found God. He said the truth was eating him alive. These were familiar phrases, almost comforting in their predictability. But the detectives had learned long ago that familiarity was not the same as honesty. When they asked him where he was on the night Marianne Keller died, he answered too quickly. When they asked how he met her, he paused too long. The rhythm was wrong. They went back over it, again and again, circling the same moments from different angles. Rourke said he'd met her at the diner. He said she'd smiled at him, that they'd talked, that she'd agreed to walk with him after her shift. He said they argued by the river, something about money, something about leaving town. He said he lost control. He said he didn't mean to kill her. He said her shoe fell off when she struggled, and for a moment, just a moment, the room leaned toward him, because that detail hadn't been public, because that detail had weight. But weight alone wasn't proof. They compared his statements to the file. The timeline didn't line up cleanly. The autopsy estimated time of death didn't quite match his version of events. He placed himself too far from the river too late in the night. He described street lights that hadn't been installed yet, small things, the kind of things a liar gets wrong not because he's careless, but because he's guessing. Then there was the ring. The silver band with a single engraved letter had been mentioned exactly once in the original reports, noted as a personal effect with no known origin. It had never been released to the media. When they asked Rourke about it, his brow furrowed. He said he didn't remember a ring. He said maybe she was wearing one. He said he didn't pay attention to that kind of thing. The detective across from him slid a photograph across the table. Rourke stared at it too long, then shook his head. It wasn't his ring. That didn't stop the headline. It didn't stop the press conference. The city had waited a decade for closure, and it wasn't in the mood to be picky. Cameras flashed as the police chief stood at the podium, voice measured, words careful but optimistic. A confession had been obtained, an arrest had been made. A family might finally have answers. In living rooms across Chicago, people nodded along, relieved, already moving on. Mary Ann Keller's mother did not. She listened in silence, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the television as if it might blink and tell her the truth if she stared long enough. She had learned to distrust sudden endings. 10 years of unanswered questions had trained her to hear the cracks beneath the surface. When she was asked how she felt, she said she was grateful. When she was asked if she believed it, she hesitated just for a second and said she hoped so. Behind the scenes, the case began to unravel almost immediately. Rourke's attorney moved fast, too fast. He challenged the confession, citing exhaustion, emotional distress, a desire for attention. He requested evidence, physical evidence, something solid. The blood under Mary Ann's fingernail was brought back into the light, a small, brownish smear on an evidence card that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. In 1979, it had been a dead end. In 1989, it was suddenly something else. They ran it. The results came back weeks later, quietly, without ceremony, delivered in a thin envelope that changed hands twice before it reached the lead detective. The DNA did not match James Rourke, not even close. There was no ambiguity, no room to argue. The blood belonged to another man entirely. The confession collapsed. Charges were dropped. The press ran quieter stories this time, buried deeper in the paper, framed as a misunderstanding, a procedural hiccup. Rourke was released, stepping out of the station into a waiting car, face pale, eyes down. A man who had almost been someone important and now wasn't. He would later tell a reporter he'd confessed because he wanted to matter. Chicago barely noticed. The Keller case slid back into the cold, but something had changed. The file was no longer inert. It had been touched, disturbed, pulled from its long sleep. And once a cold case wakes up, it rarely goes back to rest quietly. Detectives reopen everything. Old witness statements were reread with fresh eyes. Names that had been dismissed were reconsidered. The diner logs were examined again, grease-stained and faded, revealing patterns that hadn't seemed significant the first time. Mary Ann had regulars, men who came in alone, men who lingered, men whose names she might have known even if the police hadn't. One of them stood out now. His name was Joseph Calder. He was 31 in 1979, a machinist, divorced, lived 3 blocks from the diner. He had been interviewed briefly after Mary Ann's death, noted as cooperative, unremarkable, forgettable. He said he knew her name, nothing more. He said he tipped well. He said he went home alone that night. No one pressed him. There was no reason to, until someone noticed the coincidence no one had wanted to see. Joseph. The ring was re-examined. The engraving wasn't decorative. It wasn't stylized. It was plain, almost crude, as if done by hand, not a gift bought from a store, but something made or modified personally. When detectives tracked down a local jeweler who had operated in the area in the late 70s, the man squinted at the photograph and said it looked familiar. He said a man had come in once, years ago, asking to have a ring engraved with a single letter. He couldn't remember the man's face, He remembered the request because it was strange, because it was rushed, because the man had insisted on paying cash. Joseph Calder's name came back up. This time, it didn't sink. They went to his last known address. He was gone, moved years earlier, no forwarding address. Employment record showed he'd bounced between jobs. Utility records went dark. It was as if he had dissolved into the city, absorbed by it, indistinguishable from the millions of others trying not to be noticed. The city, meanwhile, remembered. Every few years, Marianne Keller's face resurfaced, on anniversary segments, on late-night news, on grainy posters taped to precinct walls, cold case, unsolved, still no answers. Each time the questions came back sharper. Each time the silence felt heavier. Detectives retired again. New ones took their place. Technology improved. Databases expanded. The blood under Marianne's fingernail was entered into systems that didn't exist when she died, compared against profiles collected for entirely different reasons. Men arrested for burglaries, for assaults, for drunk driving. Names flickered across screens, appeared, disappeared. Then, in 2003, a match hit. Not a full match, not enough for an arrest, but enough to point in a direction, enough to resurrect a name that had never quite gone away. Joseph Calder. By then, he would have been in his mid-50s. No fixed address, no recent arrests, no death record. Just a trail that stopped and started, always just ahead of the people trying to follow it. When detectives finally located him, it wasn't in Chicago. It was 2 states away, living under a slightly altered name, working a quiet job that required no questions and offered no tension. They brought him in. He denied everything. Calmly, politely, he said he barely remembered Marianne Keller. He said he had nothing to do with her death. He said he'd never seen the ring. He agreed to give a DNA sample because he had nothing to hide. He smiled when he said it. The results took time. While they waited, the city waited, too, without quite knowing why. Something about the case had re-entered the public consciousness, a low hum beneath the daily nose. Old fears stirred. Old conversations resumed. People remembered where they had been in 1979, who they had been with, what they had been afraid of. When the lab report finally arrived, it didn't scream, it didn't shout, it didn't need to. The DNA from under Marianne Keller's fingernail matched Joseph Calder. Exactly. The cold case was no longer cold, but the truth, it turned out, was still not finished with the city of Chicago. The match should have sealed it. DNA had a reputation by then, a near-mythic authority, the modern equivalent of a fingerprint stamped by science itself. In most cases, it ends arguments before they start. In this one, it opened a door that led somewhere darker, somewhere less comfortable, somewhere no one had wanted to look for more than 20 years. Joseph Calder did not react when they told him. The room was quiet, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a camera blinking red in the corner. The detective laid the lab report on the table between them, not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, letting it sit there like a dare. Calder glanced at it once, briefly, then leaned back in his chair. His hands were steady, his breathing even. He asked for a cigarette. When he was told no, he nodded and said nothing else. Silence stretched. It wasn't the panic silence of a guilty man scrambling for a story. It was the measured silence of someone weighing options, someone calculating what the truth would cost and what the lie might steal by him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled. He said the DNA didn't mean what they thought it meant. He said he'd known Mary Ann, yes, but only as a waitress. He said she'd cut herself once at the diner, broken glass, a small scene, nothing dramatic. He said he'd helped her clean it up. He said blood gets everywhere. He said the police were reaching because they wanted an ending. The detectives listened. They'd heard better stories fall apart under less pressure. They asked him about the ring. He frowned, said he'd never owned one like that. They asked him where he was on the night of the murder. He said he was home, alone, watching television. He couldn't remember what was on. He shrugged. It had been a long time ago. They pushed harder, timelined, geography, motive. Calder remained calm, but something else began to surface beneath the composure. Irritation, not fear, not remorse, annoyance, as if the questions themselves were an inconvenience, an insult to a life he'd worked hard to keep small and unnoticed. They brought in photographs, the river, the body, the ring. Mary Ann's face, younger than she'd ever be again. Calder's eyes flicked to the image, then away. His jaw tightened. For the first time the rhythm faltered. Still, he did not confess. The problem, as it soon became clear, was time. The DNA was strong, but it wasn't a complete narrative. The confession that had once closed the case was gone, its credibility destroyed. Physical evidence had been lost, degraded, mishandled in the long years between discovery and rediscovery. Witnesses had died, memories had blurred, alibis had dissolved into maybes and I thinks. The prosecution wanted certainty. The case offered only fragments. They charged him anyway. The arrest made noise, not the explosive kind from a decade earlier, but a deep, rolling sound that traveled slowly, gaining weight as it went. Papers ran retrospectives. Television stations dusted off old footage. Cold case reopened. DNA links suspect to 1979 murder. Community demands justice. The words were familiar, almost ritualistic. Joseph Calder pleaded not guilty. The trial took place in 2005, more than 25 years after Mary Ann Keller died. The courtroom was packed, heavy with expectation and something else, discomfort. This wasn't a fresh crime. There was no immediate danger to point at, no present tense fear. This was about the past, about whether the present had the right or even the ability to judge it accurately. The prosecution laid out the story carefully. The diner, the walk, the river, the DNA, the ring. They argued that Calder had fixated on Mary Ann, that the ring was a symbol of ownership, of intent. They suggested an argument, a rejection, a moment of rage. They showed the jury the lab results, the probabilities, the numbers so large they bordered on abstract. The defense dismantled the timeline. They questioned the handling of evidence. They highlighted the decade-long gap before DNA testing, the broken chain of custody, the possibility of contamination. They reminded the jury that Calder had lived under suspicion for years, without incident, that he had no history of violence, that the confession which once closed the case had been false. Reasonable doubt became their refrain. When the verdict came back, it was quiet, not guilty. The words landed softly, but the impact was anything but. Gasps rippled through the room. Mary Ann's mother closed her eyes, her hand tightening around a tissue that had long since lost its purpose. Calder exhaled a slow release of breath that looked almost like relief, almost like triumph. Outside, reporters scramble, voices overlapping, questions shouted into the air with no one left to answer them. The state declined to retry the case. The evidence, they said, would not improve with time. The door closed again. Joseph Calder walked free. Legally, he was done. The system had spoken, and it had spoken carefully. But the city was not convinced. Something about the case refused to settle, refused to stay buried. Talk radio picked it up. Late-night hosts made dark jokes. Amateur sleuths dissected the transcripts online. Mary Ann Keller became more than a victim. She became a symbol, a shorthand for something broken. Calder felt it. He moved again, changed jobs, avoided attention. Friends noticed he flinched at sirens, that he watched doors, that he drank more than he used to. He never spoke about the case, never defended himself publicly, never sued. It was as if he understood that the law's decision did not equal absolution. Years passed. Chicago changed. Neighborhoods shifted, buildings came down. The diner where Mary Ann worked closed, reopened, closed again, eventually replaced by a chain pharmacy that erased the memory of grease-stained counters and late-night coffee refills. The river kept flowing, indifferent, carrying others' secrets downstream. Then, in 2018, Joseph Calder disappeared. Not dramatically, not violently. Quietly, his employer reported him absent. His apartment was found unlocked, bed made, television off. No note, no struggle. His phone was left behind, battery dead. The news barely noticed at first. Adults go missing all the time. Lives slip through cracks without ceremony, but detectives did notice. Because cold cases have a way of recognizing each other, they reopened Calder's file, not as a suspect, but as a missing person. They traced his last known movements, a grocery store receipt, a bus ticket, a sighting near a motel outside the city, then nothing. No financial activity, no medical records, no trace. Some said he'd run. Some said he'd finally done what he'd avoided his whole life and disappeared completely. Others said something had caught up with him, something old and patient. And then, in the winter of 2021, a man walked into a church on the outskirts of Chicago and asked to speak to a priest. He was thin, older. His hair had gone almost entirely gray. He said he hadn't been to confession in decades. He said he didn't know if God would listen anymore. He said there was a woman by a river a long time ago, and he could still feel her hands on his wrists when he tried to sleep. The priest listened, and the city held its breath once more. Without yet knowing why, the priest did not interrupt him. He had learned over years of hearing other people's worst moments whispered through a screen that silence was sometimes the only thing strong enough to hold a confession without breaking it. The man sat hunched in the pew, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the dark wood floor as if it might open and swallow him whole. Outside, winter pressed against the church windows, dull and relentless, the same kind of cold that had settled over Chicago decades earlier. When Mary Ann Keller stopped breathing by the river, he said his name was Joseph. He did not give a last name. He said he had lived with it for more than 40 years. He said he had told himself 100 different stories to survive, that it was an accident, that she had pushed him, that he hadn't meant to squeeze so hard, that it had only taken seconds. He said those seconds had stretched into something endless, something that followed him everywhere. He said the trial had almost destroyed him, not because he feared prison, but because it forced him to hear her name spoken out loud again and again by strangers who would never really know what happened. The priest asked him why he was there now. Joseph laughed, a short, brittle sound that echoed in the empty church. He said he was tired. He said he had nowhere left to run. He said the world had started to feel too small, like walls closing in. He said he wanted someone to know the truth before he disappeared completely. When he finished, the priest remained silent for a long moment and told him something Joseph had not expected to hear. He said confession was not the same as consequence. He said absolution did not erase responsibility. And he said that some truths were too heavy to stay locked inside one room. The priest did not go to the police that night. He wrestled with it, alone, long after Joseph had slipped back out into the cold. The rules of confession were strict, sacred, but so was the memory of a young woman whose life had ended violently and without justice. He prayed, he paced, he replayed the words in his head the way Joseph had described the ring, the argument, the river bank slick with ice. He noticed the details, the specificity, the things that matched what little had been publicly known. By morning, he had made his decision. He contacted authorities carefully, indirectly, without naming names, describing a man who had come to him with a story that matched an unsolved homicide from 1979. He said he could not reveal everything. He said he understood the implications. He said he could not carry it alone. The call was logged, the information was forwarded, and somewhere in a police building that had seen too many cases come and go, a file was pulled from a shelf yet again. Detectives approached it cautiously this time. They had been burned before. Confessions had a way of lighting up hope and then extinguishing it just as fast. But something about this one felt different. The man had not come forward publicly. He had not asked for attention. He had not demanded immunity or forgiveness. He had gone to a place designed for secrets and left behind a trail anyway. They traced the lead quietly. They cross-referenced the timeline of Joseph Calder's disappearance with church records, security cameras, donation logs. They found him, eventually, living under another name in a neighboring county, working maintenance at a warehouse, sleeping in a room that held almost nothing personal, no photographs, no letters, no television, just a bed, a chair, and a Bible on the nightstand. When they brought him in this time, he did not resist. He looked smaller than before, frailer, as if the years had finally collected their debt. In the interview room, he did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask what evidence they had. He asked only one question. He asked if Mary Ann Keller's mother was still alive. When they said yes, his eyes filled, not dramatically, not with sobs, but with a quiet, leaking sadness that suggested something had finally broken through the layers he had built around himself. He nodded. He said he was ready. The confession this time was different. There were no grand statements, no justifications, no rehearsed lines. He spoke slowly, methodically, as if reading from a script he had memorized unwillingly over decades. He described the diner, the way Mary Ann had smiled out of habit, not interest. He described walking with her, talking too much, saying the wrong things, feeling himself lose control of the moment. He described showing her the ring, insisting it meant something she did not agree to. He described the argument escalating the shove, her slipping on the ice, his hands around her neck. He described the moment she stopped moving. He said he had panicked. He said he had stayed there longer than he should have, staring at her, hoping she would breathe again. He said he had placed her by the river because he did not know what else to do. He said he had kept the ring until later, until the guilt became unbearable, until he threw it away, until he started telling himself that none of it mattered anymore. The detectives listened. They asked questions. They interrupted when details blurred. They compared his account to the file. This time the details aligned with a precision that made the room feel colder. The missing shoe, the bruise on her jaw, the time, the position of the body. The words he used matched words that had never been printed, never been spoken outside of reports and autopsies. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds. This confession, unlike the first, was admissible. But there was still a problem. Joseph Calder had already been tried and acquitted. Double jeopardy was absolute. The law could not touch him again for Mary Ann Keller's murder. The city would have its truth. It would not have its justice. The announcement came weeks later, framed carefully, delivered with restraint. Police acknowledged receiving new information. They confirmed that the evidence and confession pointed conclusively to Joseph Calder as the killer. They stated that due to legal limitations, no further charges would be pursued. The headline hit harder than any arrest ever had. Chicago 1979 cold case closed. Confession rocks the city. People read it twice, then a third time. The word closed sat uneasily next to the reality of it all. Closed did not mean resolved. Closed did not mean healed. Closed simply meant there would be no more questions asked by the system, even if the questions continued to echo everywhere else. Mary Ann Keller's mother was informed privately. She listened without interrupting, the way she had learned to do over years of waiting. When the call ended, she sat alone in her kitchen, the same one she had sat in when her daughter's voice first stopped calling on Sunday nights. She did not cry. She said later that the tears had already been spent long ago. Joseph Calder died less than a year after the confession. Heart failure, alone, no obituary. And yet the case did not fade, because something about it, the false confession, the failed trial, the late truth, had left a scar on the city itself, a reminder that even when a cold case is closed, the cold does not always lift, and for some, it never does. Chicago tried to exhale after the announcement, but the breath caught somewhere deep in its chest. The word closure was used carefully, almost apologetically, as if everyone understood how fragile it was. Talk shows debated it. Editorials weighed it. Some called it justice delayed beyond meaning. Others called it proof that the system eventually works, even when it works too late. The arguments filled space, but they did nothing to quiet the undercurrent, the feeling that something essential had slipped through the cracks and could not be retrieved. Because for all the certainty in Joseph Calder's final confession, there was a lingering discomfort that refused to disappear. Detectives felt it first. They went back to the file one more time, not because procedure demanded it, but because instinct did. Cold cases, especially ones that end this way, leave behind a residue, unanswered micro-questions that don't make headlines, but gnaw the people who lived with them. One detective, nearing retirement, reopened the evidence list and noticed how thin it still was. A ring that had vanished, a shoe never recovered, a confession that arrived only after the law's reach had expired. They asked themselves a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Had Joseph Calder acted alone? The confession had been thorough, but it had also been controlled. He had given the city exactly what it needed to hear to settle the narrative, and nothing more. No accomplice, no witness, no other name dragged into the light. For decades, the case had been framed as a singular act of obsession and violence. One man, one victim, one night, clean, in its own terrible way. But clean stories are rare in real life. They reviewed witness statements again, this time with a different lens. A neighbor who had heard more than one voice near the river that night. A bartender who recalled seeing Mary Ann with someone else earlier in the evening, someone who wasn't Joseph. A patrol officer's note, scribbled hastily in 1979, mentioning tire tracks near the river bank that did not match Joseph Calder's car. None of it was enough to reopen anything. All of it was enough to disturb sleep. The city's memory of 1979 was messy. It was a year of fear layered on top of fear, a time when violence felt ambient, like weather. People had been less likely to call the police, less likely to insert themselves into someone else's trouble. A scream, a fight, a woman crying. These were sounds that blended into the background noise of survival. In that context, Mary Ann Keller's death had been both shocking and tragically familiar. That familiarity had protected someone. Speculation began to creep into corners of the internet and into late-night conversations that never made it onto record. None of these theories could be proven. All of them thrived in the vacuum left behind by an ending that didn't quite end. Mary Ann Keller's co-workers, scattered now across decades and distance, were contacted by reporters looking for one last quote, one last memory. Most declined. One woman, older now, voice rough with age, said Mary Ann had been afraid near the end. She said Mary Ann had mentioned a man who wouldn't leave her alone, and another man who gave her the creeps because he watched too closely. She could not remember names. She could barely remember faces. She apologized for that, as if forgetting were a kind of betrayal. Her apology echoed something many in Chicago felt. For years, the city had carried Mary Ann's face like a ghosted headline, recognizable but unfocused. People remembered that she had died. Fewer remembered who she had been. The cold case had turned her into an object lesson, a cautionary tale, a marker in time. Her laugh, her habits, the small details of her life had dissolved, leaving behind only the violence of her death. In the months after Joseph Calder's confession, a small memorial appeared near the river. No official dedication, just flowers, a photograph laminated against the weather, and a note handwritten in careful script. You were more than this. It stayed longer than anyone expected. When it finally disappeared, no one admitted to removing it. The police officially archived the case for the last time. The file was labeled cleared by confession, not solved. Not justice served, just cleared, a technical word, a bureaucratic word, a word that acknowledged resolution without claiming peace. For the detectives who had lived inside it, that distinction mattered. One of them, the same one who had noticed a ring all those years ago, boxed up his office shortly after. He took nothing from the case with him, no copies. No souvenirs. He said later that some stores weren't meant to be owned, only carried for a while and then set down carefully. But even as the system moved on, the case continued to ripple outward in quieter ways. Law schools debated it. Journalists dissected it. Cold case units across the country cited it as an example of both the power and the limits of modern forensics. DNA could tell you who had been there. It could not tell you why the truth waited so long to surface, or what damage time itself had done. And then there were the people who saw themselves in it. Women who had walked home alone at night and survived. Men who had lost control once and spent the rest of their lives pretending it hadn't mattered. Families who had waited years for answers only to discover that answers did not equal relief. For them, Marianne Keller's story wasn't about a confession or a legal technicality. It was about the long shadow a single act could cast, stretching across decades, touching lives that had never even known her name. Chicago absorbed it the way cities absorb everything. Slowly, unevenly, with scars hidden beneath new layers of noise and light. New crimes replaced old ones in the headlines. New cold cases began their quiet accumulation. The river kept flowing, carrying reflections of a skyline that had changed, and yet somehow stayed the same. But every winter, when the cold tightened its grip and the water darkened, someone would bring the case up again, in a bar, in a classroom, on a late-night drive past the Calumet River, headlights slicing through the dark. They would say her name, and for a moment the city would remember not just how the case ended, but how it never truly could. Because some cold cases don't haunt you because they're unsolved. They haunt you because they're solved too late to make the ending feel real. Time did what it always does in Chicago. It layered over the wound without sealing it. New buildings rose. Old ones fell. The river banks were cleaned, fenced, repurposed, made safer in ways that looked good on paper and meant very little at night. People jogged past the spot where Marianne Keller had been found, headphones in, breath fogging the air, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had once been the center of a city's quiet dread. But the case refused to become just another archive tragedy. In police circles, it became a reference point, a shorthand warning. Don't trust the first confession. Don't let time do your thinking for you. Younger detectives heard the story secondhand, filtered through training sessions and late-night conversations, their voices dropping instinctively when they mentioned it, as if speaking too loudly might wake something that preferred to stay asleep. What lingered most was the question no one could answer cleanly. Why now? Joseph Calder had lived with the truth for decades. He had endured suspicion, arrest, trial, acquittal. He had watched the city move on without him, watched Marianne's name become a footnote, and yet it was only after disappearing, after shedding even the thin protection of anonymity, that he chose to speak fully, not to police, not to media, but to a priest, in a room designed for absolution rather than accountability. Psychologists weighed in. Cautiously, they talked about delayed guilt, about aging offenders confronting mortality, about the erosion of mental defenses over time. They pointed to the way memory hardens, rather than fades, how certain moments replay with increasing clarity as everything else blurs. They suggested that Calder's body had aged faster than his denial, that the physical weakness had left him exposed to the thing he'd been outrunning. But theories didn't satisfy everyone. Some wondered if fear had finally caught up with him. Not fear of prison, but fear of being forgotten. A confession, even a useless one, ensures a kind of permanence. It anchors a life to a moment, however ugly. Without it, Joseph Calder risked vanishing entirely, another nameless man who lived quietly and died unnoticed. With it, he became part of a story that would be told again and again. That possibility disturbed people more than they wanted to admit, because it suggested that the confession was not an act of conscience alone, but also an act of control. The last word. Mary Ann Keller never got one. Her voice existed only in fragments now. Old photographs, a few letters saved by her mother, anecdotes repeated until they lost their edges. She had not chosen to become a lesson or a symbol. She had simply wanted to get home on a cold night. The imbalance of that fact, the ordinariness of her intention versus the enormity of its consequences, continued to resonate long after the case had been labeled closed. In the years following Calder's death, small details began to surface, almost by accident. A former co-worker came forward with a memory she dismissed for decades. She remembered Mary Ann arguing with a man outside the diner weeks before her death, not loudly, not violently, but with urgency. She remembered the way Mary Ann's shoulders had tightened, the way she'd glanced back through the window as if seeking backup she didn't expect to receive. The co-worker had assumed it was a personal matter. She had gone back to wiping counters. A retired patrol officer, clearing out his basement, found an old notebook. In it, a line about a dark sedan parked near the river that night, engine running, lights off. He had reported it at the time. It had gone nowhere. The car was never identified. The note was never followed up. These details changed nothing officially. They could not reopen a case that the law had sealed twice over, but they deepened the sense that the story, as told, was incomplete. Not false, just incomplete. The city collectively began to sit with that discomfort. It showed up in how people talked about other cold cases, how quickly skepticism surfaced when officials declared something resolved. Trust, once stretched thin, does not easily snap back into place. It remains elastic, wary, ready to recall. Mary Ann Keller's case became a touchstone for that wariness. True crime podcasts dissected it episode by episode, their host careful to balance empathy with speculation. Online forums mapped timelines and locations with obsessive precision, pinning possibilities to digital boards that felt eerily similar to the cork board the detectives had once stared at. Some users claim to have known Joseph Calder. Others claimed to have seen Mary Ann that night. Most claims dissolved under scrutiny. A few refused to. The story mutated as stories do when they pass through too many hands. In some versions, Joseph was a monster hiding in plain sight. In others, he was a weak man who lost control for a moment and spent a lifetime paying for it in ways no court could measure. In a few darker versions, he was not alone at all, just the only one who cracked. None of these versions brought Mary Ann back. Her mother died quietly in 2024, years after the confession, years after the headlines had faded. In her will, she left a box of her daughter's belongings to a local historical archive. Letters, photographs, a pressed flower from a book. No commentary, no accusation. Just evidence that Mary Ann Keller had lived, not just died. Archivists cataloged the items with professional detachment. and aware that they were preserving something more fragile than paper. They were preserving resistance to forgetting, because forgetting is the final victory in cases like this, not acquittal. Not legal loopholes forgetting, and Chicago, for all its flaws, has never been particularly good at that. Every so often, someone new stumbles across the story. A student, a journalist, a resident who had been too young to notice in 1979, and feels the same jolt of unease. The same question forms, uninvited, in the back of the mind. If the truth can wait 40 years to surface, what else is waiting? The river does not answer. It never has. It moves on, carrying reflections and debris and memories alike, indifferent to the weight they carry for the people watching from the shore. But the cold remains, not the seasonal kind, the deeper one, the kind that settles into a city's bones and reminds it, quietly and persistently, that some stories never really end. They just stop being told out loud, and in the silence that follows, the unanswered questions learn how to echo. The echo didn't fade, it changed shape. In Chicago, stories don't disappear. They migrate. They move from newspapers to whispers, from police files to classroom discussions, from first-hand memory to something half-remembered but stubbornly present. Mary Ann Keller's case settled into that strange middle ground where it was no longer current, but never quite history. People spoke about it in the conditional tense, as if it were still unfolding somewhere just out of sight. That lingering uncertainty began to affect how other cases were handled. Detectives, especially those who had come up hearing about 1979, started asking harder questions earlier. They slowed down when confessions came too easily. They pressed witnesses on details that once might have been waved away. Some called it progress, others called it paranoia. Either way, the Keller case had rewired instinct, teaching the city that closure without certainty carried its own kind of violence. In training rooms, instructors used it as an example of how time complicates truth. Evidence degrades, memories bend, narratives harden before facts do. They spoke about Joseph Calder not as a villain or a victim, but as a case study, a man who existed at the intersection of guilt, law, and limitation. It was an uncomfortable lesson, and that was precisely the point. Outside institutional walls, the story kept evolving. A journalist digging through archived police radio logs for an unrelated piece stumbled across the original dispatch call from the morning Mary Ann's body was found. The audio was degraded, warped by age, and tape hissed, but the urgency was still there. A second voice could be heard in the background, faint, almost lost, saying something unintelligible. Just before the dispatcher repeated the location, the journalist played it over and over, slowing it down, filtering it, trying to pull meaning from noise. Some listeners thought they heard a name. Others heard nothing at all. The clip circulated briefly online, then vanished, buried under skepticism and technical explanations. Audio artifacts, pareidolia, the brain finding patterns where none exist. Still, for a few days, the city buzzed with that familiar, uneasy energy, the sense that something else might be hiding just beyond reach. Former detectives were asked about it. Most declined to speculate. One, older now, voice worn thin, said only that the first moments of a case often contain more truth than years of investigation ever managed to extract. He did not elaborate. Meanwhile, the place where Mary Ann Keller died continued its quiet transformation. A new walkway was installed along the river, better lighting, emergency call boxes, signs encouraging people to report suspicious activity, safety, rendered in steel and plastic. On opening day, a small crowd gathered, officials smiling for cameras, speaking about progress, about learning from the past. No one mentioned her name. That omission did not go unnoticed. Community groups pushed for a plaque, not graphic, not accusatory, just a marker acknowledging that something had happened there, that a life had ended and mattered. The proposal stalled in committees, lost in budgets and priorities. Some argued it would stigmatize the area. Others worried it would invite morbid curiosity. In the end, nothing was installed. Absence once again won. And yet, people left things there anyway: flowers, candles, notes folded carefully and tucked into cracks in the railing. They appeared without coordination and disappeared without explanation. A quiet, informal agreement that memory did not require permission. As years passed, the legal aspect of the case receded, replaced by something more philosophical. Discussions shifted from who did it to what does it mean when truth arrives too late. Universities hosted panels, clergy debated the ethics of confession and confidentiality. Advocates for victims' families cited the case when arguing for reforms, for better communication, for more transparency when the system's hands were tied. Joseph Calder's confession, once so explosive, became almost abstract, a fact acknowledged but rarely examined in detail. People argued over his motives with a detachment that would have been impossible when he was alive. Some believed he had sought forgiveness. Others believed he had sought control. A few insisted he had been protecting someone else until the very end. No evidence ever surfaced to support that last theory, but had refused to die because the human mind struggles with singular explanations for enduring harm. It wants complexity. It wants reasons proportionate to pain. A moment of rage feels insufficient to account for decades of grief. So the story stretches, accommodating doubts and possibilities, bending to the shape of unresolved emotion. Marianne Keller's life, however, remained stubbornly simple in comparison. Born, grew up, moved for work, called home on Sundays, laughed at the wrong jokes, planned to save money, planned to go back to school someday. The normal architecture of a young adulthood that never had the chance to become complicated. That contrast between the simplicity of her intentions and the complexity of the aftermath is what kept pulling people back to the case. In late 2029, a box of unprocessed evidence from the 70s was discovered during a renovation of an old precinct building scheduled for demolition. Most of it belonged to cases long since closed, their relevance eroded by time. But one item, a small plastic bag containing a single shoe, drew attention. A women's shoe, size 6, dark leather, scuffed along the heel. The inventory tag was faded but legible. Marianne Keller. The missing shoe. It had been logged, mislabeled, then lost in a transfer decades earlier. Now it sat under fluorescent lights, suddenly present, suddenly heavy with implication. For a moment, it felt as though the past had reached forward and grabbed the present by the collar. Forensics examined it carefully, too carefully. There was little hope of extracting anything useful after so many years, but procedure demanded the attempt. Fibers were collected, residue analyzed. The process took weeks. The results, when they came back, were unremarkable. No usable DNA, no foreign material that hadn't degraded beyond recognition. The shoe offered no new answers. It was evidence only of its own long absence, of how easily crucial pieces can vanish and reappear without changing the outcome. The announcement barely made the news, but for those who followed the case closely, it landed like a quiet punch, not because it reopened anything, but because it confirmed something many had suspected all along, that the truth, even when complete, is often powerless to fix what time has already broken. The shoe was returned to storage, properly labeled this time, filed under a case officially marked closed. The echo softened again, but it did not stop. It simply waited, because in a city built on layers of stories and steel, waiting is something the past does exceptionally well. Waiting has a sound if you listen closely. In Chicago, it hums beneath traffic and trains, beneath the constant argument between wind and concrete. It is the sound of unfinished business, of questions left parked in corners where no one quite knows what to do with them. Mary Ann Keller's case learned that sound well. It became part of it. By the early 2030s, the people who had been adults in 1979 were aging into quiet invisibility. Memories once sharp now arrived softened, rounded at the edges, more emotional than factual. That shift did not erase the case. It changed how it was carried. What had once been a hunt for answers became something closer to a meditation on consequence. The police department, facing pressure to modernize, digitized its archives. Boxes were scanned, tapes converted. Old cases re-entered the system in searchable form, stripped of dust, but not of ambiguity. Mary Ann Keller's file, now a constellation of PDFs and audio clips, was accessed more often than most. Students, journalists, detectives from other cities, people who had never set foot in Chicago, but felt drawn to the shape of the story. Each access left a trace. Analysts began to notice patterns in how the case was revisited. Interest spiked every winter. Every time the river froze just enough to look solid, but never enough to trust. Seasonal memory, they called it. The way cold sharpens recollection, the way certain crimes align themselves with weather in the public mind. One analyst, younger, newer, asked a question in a meeting that stole the room. What if the confession, even the final one, wasn't the whole truth? Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete by design. The idea was not new, but hearing it framed that way shifted something. Confessions are narratives. They are shaped, consciously or not, to achieve a goal: forgiveness, control, relief. Joseph Calder's last confession had achieved all three. It had given the city an ending, given him release, and sealed the story in a form that could not legally be challenged. It had also centered him. Mary Ann Keller once again existed at the margins of her own case. That realization unsettled people. In response, a group of researchers began reframing cold cases not around perpetrators, but around victims, their movements, their relationships, the small decisions that shaped their final days. They called it victim-centric analysis. Mary Ann's case became a pilot, a way to test whether shifting perspective could reveal something that decades of suspect-focused investigation had missed. They mapped her life, not just the last night, but the weeks before it, her schedule, her routines, her phone calls, her letters home. They looked for disruptions, anything that suggested fear, anticipation, pressure. They found a pattern that had once seemed insignificant. Mary Ann had changed her route home several times in the weeks leading up to her death. Sometimes she walked, sometimes she waited for the bus, sometimes she detoured, stopping at a grocery or a friend's place. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, the kind of change a person makes when they are trying to avoid someone without admitting it, even to themselves. The researchers cross-referenced those changes with diner logs and witness statements. A second name surfaced again, faint but persistent. A man who had been in the diner frequently, often overlapping with Joseph Calder, but not always. A man who had never been seriously questioned because he had never done anything overt enough to attract attention. His name was Alan Weiss. He had been 42 in 1979, married to children. Worked nights as a security supervisor at a nearby industrial site. He had an alibi for the night of the murder. On duty, logged in. The alibi had never been deeply examined because it appeared solid and because the focus had quickly shifted elsewhere. The researchers did not accuse him. They did not need to. They simply noted proximity, overlap, opportunity. When they dug deeper, they found something else. Alan Weiss had died in 1994, heart attack at work. His personnel file described him as reliable, quiet, and remarkable. His obituary mentioned a love of fishing, a devotion to family, nothing that suggested a connection to a young woman found dead by a river 15 years earlier. Nothing that disproved it either. The revelation sparked debate, not outrage. Weiss was gone. He could not be questioned. His family had lived for decades without any hint of scandal. To drag his name into the case now would achieve nothing tangible. The researchers documented the findings carefully, neutrally, and stopped short of conclusions. But the idea lodged itself in the collective imagination. What if Joseph Calder had been telling the truth as he understood it? That he had killed Mary Ann, but not the whole truth of how the night unfolded. What if there had been another presence, another pressure, another set of eyes shaping the moment? What if guilt had not been evenly distributed, and confession had absorbed more than its share? No evidence supported this. No evidence refuted it. The city responded the way it always does to ambiguity. It argued, quietly, persistently, in articles and footnotes, in online forums and academic papers, in conversations that began with "I know it's closed." But the case, once officially sealed, had become porous. Not legally, culturally. Mary Ann Keller's name began appearing in contexts far removed from crime reporting. Discussions about memory, about narrative control, about whose voices survive institutional processes. Her story was no longer just about a murder in 1979. It was about the long tail of harm, about how systems prioritize endings over accuracy, about how truth can be both sufficient and inadequate at the same time. And through it all, the river remained unchanged. It flowed past the walkway and the lights and the quiet memorials, carrying silt and history alike. People stopped there sometimes, not knowing why, just feeling the weight of the place. They looked at the water and thought about time, how it moves, how it hides things, how it refuses to give them back. The waiting continued, not for an arrest, not for a trial, but for something harder to define, a sense that the story had finally been told in a way that did not leave anyone out. And that kind of ending, if it exists at all, does not arrive quickly. By the time the case entered its 5th decade of life, it no longer belonged to the police or the courts. It belonged to the city's subconscious, a shared memory that surfaced unpredictably, triggered by weather, by anniversaries, by the sound of a woman's footsteps behind you on an empty street. Mary Ann Keller had become a reference point for unease, a name people use when they wanted to talk about injustice without sounding abstract. And yet, for all its cultural weight, the story still resisted a clean emotional landing, because the more people examined it, the clearer it became that the confession, the moment meant to anchor everything, had also distorted it. Joseph Calder's words had arrived at the exact moment when they could do the least legal good and the most narrative damage. They froze the case in place, locking in a version of events that could neither be tested nor expanded. Every new question now sounded like doubt. Every alternative theory sounded like disrespect. The confession had closed the door even as it left windows open. That tension split the audience. Some insisted the case was finished. Calder confessed. The details matched. The city had its answer. To keep digging, they argued, was to chase ghosts and risk rewriting a truth that had already cost enough. Others felt the opposite. To them, the confession was the beginning, not the end. Proof that time had been lying all along, and that patience, not certainty, was the real currency of justice. The divide wasn't loud. It didn't play out in protest or courtrooms. It lived in comment sections and footnotes and the careful wording of lectures and essays. It lived in the pause people took before saying closed out loud. A filmmaker tried to capture it once. The documentary took 3 years to make. No reenactments, no ominous music, just voices, archival material, long shots of the river at different times of year. The filmmaker avoided conclusions, letting contradiction sit uncomfortably side by side. When it premiered at a local festival, the audience stayed seated long after the credits ended. Someone finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. If Calder confessed, a woman said, "Why does it still feel like we're missing something?" No one answered right away. The filmmaker eventually said that some stories don't end because the harm they describe hasn't finished rippling. He said Mary Ann Keller's death had not only taken a life, it had altered a city's relationship with certainty. It had taught Chicago that truth is not always a destination. Sometimes it's a process that never fully concludes. That idea unsettled people more than any theory about accomplices or missing evidence, because it meant living with ambiguity. And Chicago, for all its resilience, has never been especially comfortable with that. The case continued to surface in unexpected places. A judge referenced it in a ruling about post-acquittal confessions. A sociology paper cited it when discussing narrative ownership in criminal justice. A community safety workshop mentioned it as an example of why people should trust their instincts, even when nothing overtly dangerous is happening. Each mention stretched the story further from its origin and closer to myth. Mary Ann Keller, the real woman, risked being lost again, this time beneath layers of analysis and symbolism. Some advocates pushed back against that drift. They organized small remembrance events on the anniversary of her death. No speeches, no cameras, just quiet gatherings where her name was spoken without qualifiers, without theories attached. They read aloud the few facts that could not be argued. She was 23. She worked hard. She did not come home. Everything else, they said, was secondary. Those gatherings did something subtle but important. They recentered the case not around its mystery, but around its cost. They reminded people that the unanswered questions mattered because a life had been interrupted, not because uncertainty itself was interesting. Still, the uncertainty remained. In private, some former investigators admitted that if the case were active today, it would be handled differently. Digital tracking, surveillance cameras, data analysis that did not exist in 1979, the margin for disappearance had narrowed. The space in which a man like Joseph Calder could confess, recede, and die without resolution had shrunk. But the past does not benefit from modern tools. It only absorbs modern interpretation. The river, unchanged, continued to witness these evolving meanings. It had seen industry rise and fall, neighborhoods transform, names come and go. It had seen bodies before and would see them again. To the river, Mary Ann Keller was a moment, not a mystery. To the city, she was both. As the years edged closer to 2050, interest in the case began to thin. Not disappear, but soften, like an echo finally losing volume. New tragedies claimed attention. New cold cases demanded space in the collective mind. The Keller case transitioned into something like a cautionary parable, invoked rather than investigated. And yet, every so often, someone new would encounter it for the first time. They would read about the false confession. They would read about the acquittal. They would read about the final admission that changed nothing legally and everything emotionally. And they would feel that same familiar chill. Because the story does not warn you with spectacle, it doesn't rely on twist or revelations. Its power comes from accumulation, from the slow realization that the systems designed to deliver certainty often arrive late, fractured, and incomplete. In that way, Mary Ann Keller's case does not shock. It unsettles. It leaves you with the uncomfortable awareness that some truths surface only when they can no longer be acted upon, and that knowing something too late can be its own kind of injustice. The city lives with that knowledge now, quietly, patiently, waiting, not for answers, but for the courage to admit that some stories, once open, never fully close. And in that waiting, the cold lingers. What most people didn't notice at first was how the language around the case began to change. Not the facts. Those had been frozen for years, but the verbs. Reporters stopped saying solved and started saying declared solved. Commentators avoided truth and leaned toward accepted version. Even the phrase cold case closed was increasingly followed by a pause, as if the speaker were waiting to see whether anyone would challenge it. That shift mattered, because language is how a city negotiates guilt it can't quite place. Inside the Chicago Police Department, the Keller file remained technically inactive, but it was never untouched. New detectives, especially those assigned to cold case units, were encouraged to read it early in their careers. Not as a success story, not as a failure either, as a warning. They were told to study how pressure distorts memory, how repetition can manufacture certainty, how a confession, once spoken aloud, begins to overwrite competing narratives, even when it shouldn't. They were told that Joseph Calder's final statement was both powerful and useless, emotionally decisive, procedurally inert, a confession without consequence. For some detectives, that contradiction became personal. One investigator, decades removed from the original team, admitted in an interview that the Keller case had reshaped how he conducted every interrogation. Afterward, he learned to slow down, to let silence breathe, to resist the urge to connect dots too quickly. He said the worst mistake an investigator can make is falling in love with a story before it proves it loves you back. That line stuck. It circulated quietly among law enforcement circles, detached from its origin, until few remember it had anything to do with Mary Ann Keller at all. Outside the system, the case took on another life. One less controlled, more fragmented. Online forums dissected Calder's confession word by word, treating it like scripture or fiction depending on the reader's bias. Amateur analysts mapped timelines, compared weather records, argued about river currents, as if physics itself could still deliver a verdict. Some believed Calder acted alone. Others believed he didn't act at all. A smaller, more controversial group suggested something harder to accept, that the confession itself was an attempt at authorship, that Calder, nearing death, may have wanted to step into a narrative larger than his own life, to be remembered not as a forgotten suspect, but as the man who ended Chicago's most haunting cold case. There was no way to disprove that theory, and that was the problem. Every explanation now carried equal weight and equal fragility. The case had become a hall of mirrors, each reflection convincing until you noticed the distortion at the edges. For Mary Ann Keller's remaining family, this evolution was exhausting. They had wanted closure. What they received was permanence. Her name no longer faded with time. It crystallized. It became a reference point that refused to soften. Interviews came less frequently, but when they did, the questions were heavier, more philosophical. Do you believe the confession? Do you feel justice was served? What does closure mean to you now? There were no good answers. One relative finally said that closure was a word people use when they're uncomfortable with grief that doesn't behave properly. That some losses don't resolve. They integrate. They become part of how you understand risk, trust, and nightfall. That statement never made headlines, but it circulated. It resonated, because by then the Keller case wasn't really about who killed Mary Ann Keller. It was about what happens when a society realizes that even its most definitive moments can rest on unstable ground. The city itself seemed to acknowledge this quietly. No monuments were built, no plaques installed. There was no official memorial along the river. Instead, there were absences, a bench that remained unmarked, a stretch of walkway that locals avoided at night without knowing why. Urban memory doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. On the anniversary of the confession's release, a major newspaper ran a small piece, not on the front page, not even in Metro News. It was tucked into an opinion column, framed as a meditation on time and accountability. The writer argued that Calder's words had closed a legal chapter, but opened a moral one. The final line read, "A case can be closed without being complete." No corrections followed, no rebuttals. That silence was telling, because the city had, by then, learned to live with incomplete endings. The Keller case began appearing in academic syllabi, criminology, ethics, journalism. Students debated whether publishing Calder's confession had been responsible, whether it honored the victim or centered the perpetrator. Whether withholding it would have been worse, each debate ended the same way, with discomfort, with no consensus, with the realization that every option carried harm, and maybe that, too, was part of the case's legacy. The understanding that sometimes justice is not a straight line toward resolution, but a field of compromises where every step costs something. As time continued to pass, the witnesses aged out of relevance. Memories blurred further, physical locations changed. Buildings were demolished, streets renamed, the city's surface evolved, but the story beneath it stayed stubbornly intact, cold, unresolved in spirit. If not on paper, Joseph Calder's grave remained unremarkable. No flowers, no notes, no evidence that anyone visited with regularity. Whatever truth he carried with him into the ground stayed there, sealed by the same silence that had followed Mary Ann Keller into the river decades earlier, and that symmetry did not go unnoticed. People spoke of it in hushed tones. The idea that the case had begun and ended with disappearance, that nothing tangible had ever fully emerged, that even the confession was, in a way, another vanishing act, words offered without the burden of consequence. In the end, the Keller case didn't teach Chicago how to solve a crime. It taught the city how to sit with doubt, how to acknowledge that certainty, sometimes a luxury of the present, and available to the past, how to accept that some questions survive not because they are unsolvable, but because answering them would require time travel, and time does not cooperate. The case remained closed, but it did not rest. It lingered in the collective awareness, a low-frequency hum beneath everyday life, reminding anyone who listened closely that resolution is not the same as peace, and that knowing who did something is not always enough to understand why it mattered, or why it still hurts. The city moved forward, but it did not move on. Years later, long after the headlines had yellowed and the broadcasts had been archived, the Keller case still surfaced in places no one expected. It appeared in casual conversations between strangers who didn't realize they were circling the same memory, in late-night cab rides when the river slid past the windows like a dark ribbon and someone would lower their voice without knowing why, because discomfort had become the case's final inheritance. There was no single moment when the city collectively decided how it felt about Joseph Calder's confession. No vote, no verdict beyond the one already rendered by time. Instead, opinion fragmented quietly. Some accepted the story because they needed an ending. Others rejected it because they sensed the cost of believing too easily. Most hovered somewhere in between. That middle ground was the hardest place to live. It meant accepting that Mary Ann Keller's last moments were still unknowable, that the exact sequence of fear, resistance, or resignation would never be reconstructed, that no amount of narrative, however compelling, could substitute for the missing facts swallowed by water, darkness, and delay. And yet her name endured, not as a cautionary tale, not as a symbol, but as a presence, a reminder that unresolved violence does not fade. It adapts. It embeds itself into routines, into the way city teaches its children to look over their shoulders, into the subtle tightening of grip on a steering wheel when crossing a bridge at night. Mary Ann Keller became part of Chicago's internal geography, not mapped, but felt. Somewhere along the line, the phrase cold case stopped meaning inactive. It came to mean something else entirely, a case that refuses warmth, refuses closure, refuses to be softened by repetition. The Keller file was closed, yes, but its temperature never changed. It stayed cold. Detectives who encounter it late in their careers described a strange sensation, the feeling of being watched by the past, not haunted in the supernatural sense, but audited, as if every decision they made was being measured against a question they could never answer. Would you have done better? That question had no safe response. Even Joseph Calder's confession, once so explosive, eventually lost its sharpness. It became familiar, quotable, almost neutral, its shock dulled by overexposure, its edges smoothed by analysis and reinterpretation. But familiarity did not equal acceptance. In private moments, people still wondered what Calder didn't say, what details he skipped, whether the gaps were intentional or simply the result of a memory too old to trust, whether the truth, if it existed in a complete form at all, had died long before he did. The city never tried to reopen the case, not officially. There were no press conferences announcing new evidence, no surprise warrants, no dramatic reversals. The machinery of justice had decided it had reached the end of its track. Anything beyond that would require belief rather than proof, and belief, once fractured, does not easily reassemble. Instead, the Keller case settled into a quieter role, a reference point for uncertainty, a reminder that not every ending is earned, and not every answer is real, that sometimes the most honest outcome is one that admits its own limitations. That admission lingered. It shaped how future cases were handled, how confessions were vetted, how narratives were framed. It made investigators more cautious, journalists more skeptical, and audiences, at least some of them, more aware of the space between story and fact. That space mattered because it was where Mary Ann Keller still existed, not as a solved problem, but as an unresolved human absence. A life interrupted without explanation sufficient to balance the scales. On certain nights, when the city was quiet enough to hear itself breathe, that absence felt heavier. The river moved as it always had, indifferent and patient. The streets glowed under sodium lights. The skyline held its shape against the dark. Everything appeared stable, and yet, beneath that surface, the case remained exactly where it had always been, suspended between certainty and doubt, between confession and consequence, between closure and truth. Chicago learned to live with that suspension. It learned that some stories do not conclude, they settle. They sink into the bedrock of collective memory and stay there, exerting pressure long after the noise fades. The Keller case was declared closed, but its echo never was. It continued in every unanswered question, every uneasy pause, every instinctive glance toward the river when the night grew to quiet, not as a scream, not as a warning, but as a low, persistent reminder that some cold cases do not end, they endure. Even now, when the city insists the story is finished, the Keller case refuses to behave like something past. It lives in margins, in footnotes, and the way certain names still trigger a pause among people who are never supposed to remember them. Mary Ann Keller is one of those names, not spoken often, but never spoken lightly, as if saying it too loudly might summon questions no one is prepared to answer. Time has altered almost everything else. The river bank where she was last seen no longer looks the same. Concrete has replaced cracked stone. New railings stand where old ones once rusted. Joggers pass through in daylight, headphones in, eyes forward, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once hosted a crowd of flashing lights, yellow tape, and police radios hissing in the dark. Progress is efficient that way. It covers what it cannot fix, but memory is less cooperative because every city carries a second version of itself, the visible one and the remembered one. And in Chicago's remembered version, that stretch of river still belongs to 1979. The air is colder. The night feels unfinished. 10. Somewhere just beyond sight, a young woman vanishes without leaving behind a version of events solid enough to survive scrutiny. That unresolved image has weight. It presses down quietly, shaping how people interpret endings, how they listen to confessions, how they react when officials say this time, we're sure. The Keller case trained the city to flinch, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to create hesitation. Years after Calder's death, a retired journalist admitted he still kept the original notes from the first night of reporting folded inside a drawer. He said he didn't know why he hadn't thrown them away. There was nothing actionable left in them, no mislead, no overlooked name, just impressions, confusion, contradictions scribbled in haste. He said those notes reminded him that the truth doesn't always arrive as a clean narrative. Sometimes it arrives fragmented, incompatible with itself, demanding humility rather than certainty. That humility was missing in 1979, and maybe that was the tragedy that lingered longest, the sense that the case had outrun the tools meant to contain it, that the investigation, the media, the public, all of them, had been chasing resolution faster than understanding. Joseph Calder's confession fit neatly into that hunger. It gave shape to chaos. It offered a voice where silence had ruled. It made the unbearable feel, briefly, manageable. But manageability is not the same as accuracy, and that distinction haunted the aftermath, because once a case is closed, even imperfectly, it begins to resist reopening. Files harden, narratives calcify, doubt becomes inconvenient. Over time, questioning the conclusion starts to feel like disrespect to the victim, to the process, to the idea of justice itself. So people stop asking, not because they are satisfied, but because they are tired. That fatigue settled over the Keller case like dust, gradual, almost invisible, until one day it became clear that the questions were no longer being avoided. They were being forgotten, and forgetting, in its own way, is a kind of ending, but not a clean one, because the absence remains. Mary Ann Keller never grew older. She never accumulated decades of ordinary life to blur the sharpness of her disappearance. She remained fixed in time, a young woman framed forever by police sketches, grainy photographs, and the speculative language of cold case analysis. Frozen, cold. In that way, the label cold case became more than a procedural term. It described the emotional temperature of the story itself, distant, preserved, untouched by resolution. Chicago learned to coexist with that cold. It folded the case into its mythology, not as a legend with a moral, but as an unresolved chord that never quite resolves. No matter how long the music plays, new generations heard about it indirectly. Not through headlines, but through tone, through the way older relatives react to stories about confessions surfacing decades late, through skepticism passed down without explanation. Don't believe endings too easily. That was the lesson, and so the Keller case endured, not as an open wound, but as a scar you only notice when the weather changes, when a similar story breaks, when another name joins the list of disappearances, and the same promises are made. This time will be different. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And the Keller case stands as the reminder that difference is not guaranteed by declaration. That closure announced is not closure earned. That truth does not always arrive in time to matter the way we want it to. The file remains closed. The river continues to move. The city continues to speak. But somewhere beneath all of it, the unresolved question persists. Not loudly, not insistently, but faithfully. What really happened that night? No confession has fully answered it. No ending has erased it. And maybe that is the final truth of the Keller case, that some stories do not seek resolution. They seek remembrance. And as long as the city remembers, even imperfectly, the case is not finished. It is merely quiet. Silence, in the end, became the Keller case's most enduring witness, not the dramatic kind that follows a verdict or a funeral, but the quieter silence that settles after a story has been told too many times and still fails to explain itself. The kind that doesn't demand attention yet refuses to disappear. It lingered in Chicago long after the microphones were turned off, long after the case number stopped being spoken aloud, because silence is what remains when language runs out. For years, officials insisted that closing the file was an act of respect, that letting the case rest honored the victim, that reopening old wounds served no one, and on paper, that logic held. Institutions are built to move forward, not to circle endlessly around uncertainty. But cities don't operate on paper. They operate on memory, instinct, and the quiet accumulation of unresolved moments. And in that realm the Keller case never found a place to settle. It floated unanchored, too complete to dismiss, too incomplete to accept. People still drove past the river and felt it, a subtle tightening, a sense that something important had happened there once, something that never fully concluded. They didn't always know the details. They didn't need to. The atmosphere carried the story forward without explanation. That was the strange power of it. The case no longer required facts to survive. It had crossed into something else, a shared unease inherited rather than learned, a story told through pauses, not sentences. Marianne Keller's name surfaced less often now, but when it did, it carried weight disproportionate to its frequency. It appeared in discussions about ethics, about delayed justice, about the reliability of memory. It became shorthand for a particular kind of failure, not of effort, but of certainty. And that distinction mattered because no one could say the case hadn't been worked. No one could claim it had been ignored. The hours logged, the leads chased, the theories tested. All of it was real, all of it mattered. And still, the truth remained just out of reach. That realization unsettled people. It suggested that some mysteries are not solved or unsolved, but lived with. That resolution is sometimes less about answers and more about endurance, about how long a community can carry a question without collapsing under its weight. Chicago carried it, not proudly, not gracefully, but persistently. Over time, the Keller case stopped being framed as a failure and started being understood as a limit, a demonstration of how far systems can go and where they must stop. It exposed the edge of certainty, the point beyond which evidence fades into interpretation and interpretation into belief. That edge is uncomfortable. Most people would rather not look at it too closely, yet the case forced them to. Every time another cold case was announced as solved, someone would inevitably ask, quietly, sometimes only to themselves, solved how? With proof, with confession, with time simply running out? Those questions did not derail new cases, but they slowed them. They introduced friction, they demanded care. In that way, Mary Ann Keller's disappearance changed things without ever being resolved. It made doubt respectable. It made skepticism responsible. It reminded a city that truth is not always loud and justice is not always complete. As the decade stretched on, fewer people who remembered 1979 firsthand were still around to speak about it. First-hand memory thinned, second-hand accounts softened. The story became more abstract, less anchored to specific faces and moments. But abstraction did not weaken it. If anything, it strengthened its reach, because now the Keller case wasn't just about one woman on one night. It was about every story that ended too cleanly, every confession that arrived too late, every promise of closure that asked to be believed rather than proven. It became a caution without instructions, a question without an answer key, and perhaps that was its final form. Not a case to be solved, but a tension to be maintained, a reminder that certainty should be handled carefully, that endings deserve scrutiny, that silence can mean many things. Not all of them peaceful. The city never erected a marker for Mary Ann Keller. No stone, no inscription, but her absence marked something deeper than a place. It marked a boundary, the line between knowing and assuming, between resolution and acceptance. That line still exists. It runs quietly through Chicago, invisible but intact, crossed daily by people who don't realize it's there, and every time it's crossed, the same unresolved echo follows behind, unacknowledged but present. The case was closed, the confession was recorded, the city moved on, but the truth, whatever shape it once had, remains suspended in that narrow space where answers should be, reminding anyone willing to listen that some stories do not conclude. They endure as questions, and questions, once embedded deeply enough, never truly go silent. If there was a final transformation of the Keller case, it happened quietly, without announcement. It happened when the story stopped belonging to those who investigated it, reported it, or argued about it, and began belonging to those who simply carried it, people who had never opened the file, never watched the original broadcasts, never read the transcripts of Calder's confession, yet still felt the residue of it in the way they understood loss. By then, the case had lost its edges, dates blurred, names faded. What remained was atmosphere, a sense that something important had slipped through time's fingers. In classrooms, professors referenced it without naming it. They spoke about delayed confessions, about the psychology of memory under pressure, about how narratives harden when left unchallenged. Students nodded, took notes, moved on, unaware they were being shaped by a case that refused to disappear. In newsrooms, younger journalists learned caution from stories they never covered. Editors reminded them to avoid definitive language too early, to treat closure as provisional, to respect uncertainty. Those habits did not come from theory. They came from experience passed down, story by story, omission by omission. The Keller case was one of those experiences. It taught restraint by example, and restraint is not dramatic. It doesn't make headlines, it doesn't trend, but it changes how stories are told long after the original facts have gone cold. For Mary Ann Keller, this evolution offered no justice in the traditional sense, no sentence served, no final accounting. Her life remained truncated, her ending unresolved, her voice absent from the record that bore her name. Yet she was not erased. Her absence became instructive. It reminded a city that even when institutions move on, the emotional math of a crime does not resolve so easily, that grief does not obey timelines, that unanswered questions have a way of reorganizing themselves into something quieter but more durable. Somewhere along the way, people stopped asking whether Joseph Calder was guilty and started asking a different question. What does it mean to accept an answer? Is acceptance an act of trust or an act of exhaustion? That question lingered. It appeared whenever someone confronted an ending that felt too clean, whenever a confession surfaced decades late, whenever a case was declared closed without the relief people expected to feel. The Keller case had recalibrated expectation. It had taught Chicago that closure is not a moment, but a negotiation between evidence and belief, between hope and resignation, between the desire for peace and the responsibility to doubt. That negotiation never ends. The river still flows through the city, unchanged in its indifference. It reflects the skyline at night, carrying light and shadow alike. People cross it without thinking, unaware that beneath the surface of routine lies a story that never settled. And maybe that is how the case survives, not as a warning shout from the past, but as a presence folded into the present, a quiet reminder that truth does not always arrive in time, and that even when it does, it may arrive incomplete. The Keller case did not collapse under its own uncertainty. It adapted. It became less about answers and more about awareness, less about resolution and more about humility. It left behind no monument, no verdict that satisfied everyone, no ending that felt earned. What it left behind was harder to name. A hesitation, a pause before belief, a shadow that lengthens whenever certainty speaks too loudly. And in that shadow, Mary Ann Keller remains, not solved, not forgotten, but held in a space where questions are allowed to exist without apology. The file may be closed, the confession may be recorded, but the case continues in the only place it ever truly lived, in the unresolved space between what is known and what is claimed, in the silence that follows every ending that arrives too late, and in the city that learned slowly and reluctantly that some cold cases do not seek resolution. They seek vigilance.